Welcome to our second Be Honest conversation. Tonight, our topic is Swedenborgian anti-racism then and now. And I am so pleased to have my friend Sue Dittmeyer here to share about her research, which is going to be published this June in a new book called Overlooked: Black Ministers in a White Denomination. And not only are you an archivist and a researcher, but you are an activist, and you are active in Swedenborgians in action against racism. So today will be a time to talk about your research, what you're learning from your study of the past, and then also your vision and hopes for the present and the future. And, this initiative is inspired by Helen Keller, who really lived that faith of recognizing that this call to be a new church is more than just setting up a chapel or creating a liturgy, but really about how we live in the world and this invitation to a radical new way of living this. And she really integrated her politics and her faith into one thing, which I certainly believe is what we're really all called to do. So we can really live in this world that recognizes that we're all children of God. For those who are here and listening in, as we go along, if you have any questions, you can pop them in the chat, and Sue's happy to be responsive as we go along. So please feel free to offer those up as we go along, and we'll just see where this all takes us. And I wonder, Sue, if you want to start with just sharing kind of how you got into all of this research and spirituality, the vision of the new church, and this work of anti-racism.
Well, I did think back to why I'm actually different from my family. It's an interesting story because it all goes back to when I was 4 or 5 years old. And, we have the whole idea of remains in our church. And it really, really goes back to that. And it's when we learned, I don't sing very well, so I'll just mouth the words. Jesus loves the little children, all the little children of the world, red, yellow, black, and white. They are precious in his sight. God loves the little children of the world. And that reached my soul.
You took that seriously.
I took it very seriously. And I thought it was an unusual story, but I was at a book club meeting at the Harriet Beecher Stowe House on Sunday, and we were talking about racism there. And I told that story to the group, and a man came up to me afterwards and said he had the same experience.
Yeah.
With the same song.
Mm-hmm. So in your parents' background, they had a lot of racist ideology?
Not open.
Yeah.
Like the undercurrent.
Yeah.
But they always thought, where did she come from?
You're very much like Helen in that way. I mean, her father was a Confederate soldier. And I think of all of the issues she spoke out against, it was racism that she experienced the most backlash, because she was a daughter of the South. And it's a big thing to break from your family in that way. But yet I love that story because it is at the heart of all of our faith, right? Every sermon is God loves us. God loves everyone. And yet it's so unlived in so much of the population.
So that's why
origin story.
I care so much about this, and I always have. I left home 2 weeks after I turned 18 and moved to downtown Cincinnati, only a block from where I live now, and lived at the YWCA. So that's a little bit in my background as to why this topic is such a concern to me. Sure. I remember when the Freedom Riders were riding the buses in the South. I was 11 years old, but I thought I could do that. I should just leave home and go do that. And then I realized I was 11 and they probably wouldn't let me. But, I was really caught up in the civil rights movement.
Sure. Yeah.
So
that's a sort of a middle piece, the civil rights movement. And then your research has brought you back to before the civil rights movement. And then now we're here. Where do you want to begin in sharing about your research and where we are now?
Well, why don't you share a little bit about Helen?
Sure. Yeah.
And her experience with Du Bois.
Sure. So I think there's a lot of resonance between you and Helen. So again, she knew the truth, right? That we're all the same, and some may wonder if that was because of her disability, that she was blind and deaf, so she wasn't as swayed by the material world. But very early on, she met Du Bois as a child. She was, I think, 11 or 12, similar age to you, getting ready to go out with the Freedom Riders.
Was
And he came to Perkins Institute, the School for the Blind, actually with William James, who was his professor at the time at Harvard. So they came and met her, and they were immediately taken with each other. And W.E.B. Du Bois definitely had a sense that this blind and deaf woman would understand the truth kind of more than a seeing person. And soon after that, she wrote a very moving letter to W.E.B. Du Bois about the color line, and that eventually it will be dismantled. He published that letter in his publication. I think it was called The Crisis, which was the NAACP publication at the time. And she also sent $100. She sent a donation. And just that one little action caused just huge upset in her family, in her local community. Letters were written, and she never relented. But she did get a little quieter after that. I think, and at the same time, in her work for the blind, she continued to advocate for people of color who were blind and institutions. And so it was always a part of her. It was always a part of her advocacy for equality. But that was the one primary action that she took early on in her life. And it's interesting. Anti-racism wasn't a thing at that point, right? It was sort of this idea that I think she's sometimes criticized with her idyllic vision. The new heaven will come when we all wake up. And I think what we're coming to see is we actually have to really work to dismantle. We have to work against it. We have to not only see beyond it and say, I believe in equality. We have to root it out in a sense, root it out and tell these stories, which I think is so much of what you're doing with researching our real history of how have we engaged with Black leadership, Black community. How have we been in relationship in positive ways? How have we advocated in good ways that have been helpful? And how have we done harm? And then to take responsibility for that. So we do have one question. How old was Helen when she wrote that letter and sent the contribution? $100 would be a large amount of money at that time. Yes, that's a good question. I believe she was still quite young, and it was quite a bit of money. I'll try to get back to you before the end. I'm sorry, I don't have that information off the top of my head. I know it was when she was still a young woman. She was not a wealthy person, but she wasn't poor. And she had resources. She had benefactors at that point. So it's hard to know exactly where the money would have come from. I never really thought that through, but you're right. It would have been a pretty big donation at the time. So that's kind of Helen's story. And of course, she was a new church woman. And she was a new church woman, beginning at 16. So my sense is that wasn't in her field quite yet when she met W.E.B. Du Bois, but it was in her field soon afterwards. Oh, she was 35 per Google. There you go. So by then, she was definitely a Swedenborgian. And in many of her speeches, she uses the language of the new heaven and the new earth. That was how she envisioned this era of equality that she was advocating for racial justice, primarily for economic justice. That was really her focal issue in her early 20s. But then, of course, for advocacy for the disability community as well. That's kind of Helen's story.
Well, how I got started on this after George Floyd was murdered, group of Swedenborgians got together and formed Swedenborgians in Action Against Racism. Now, I was not in it at first because I was not well, but about maybe a year or so after they got started, I joined them, and we were talking about racism, both outside but also inside our own denomination. And we knew about two ministers. We knew that there was Gladys, and we knew that there was her stepfather and her grandfather. So it was three. And that we also knew that there was a Black church in Washington, D.C. But that's all we knew about, and not much about that. We just knew that they existed. So, being an avid historian all my life, I decided I wanted to look at it. And I did start looking. And it's amazing that our convention journals have reports from ministers in them. And I was able to find a lot of stuff. And for a couple years, I would bring what I had found to convention and have little groups and talk about it. And then I guess about 3 years ago, I decided I wanted to write a book about it because I wanted to tell more than what I could do in half an hour. These were amazing men and women, and I thought they deserved more than that. So I started working on the book, and I was pretty close to being done last year, but then Black history started disappearing. It actually started disappearing while I was on the National Park Service website. An article I was reading and transcribing disappeared.
Oh my goodness.
While I was
Live
to me, and I rebooted my machine, tried to get back to it, and it was just gone. So that when my book comes out, the last fourth of the book, about 50 pages, is actually little scripts of text about Black history, because I think you need to understand what was going on in this country when the ministers were alive.
Sure, to give them the context.
Yes, to get some context.
Yeah.
So that's part of the book.
So all this research came from old messengers and journals?
Almost all of it, messengers and convention journals. And it was just amazing. And even Jim Lawrence would say, where are you finding this? I'm like, it's in the journal.
All right there.
It's all right there, and I would love to have more information about some of them, but there's enough to really get a feeling for who these people were.
Yeah. And I love that you're contributing to Black history at the same moment that it's being erased, and who knows what it will stir next in terms of information. So what can you tell us about some of these people and communities?
Well, the first one has what I call a Swedenborgian coincidence, but we don't believe there's any coincidence.
No.
The first one was a former slave, and he was living on a plantation and speaking for the Methodist Episcopal Church. He was a minister for them. He was very uneducated, and there was a woman who was staying at that plantation where he was living, and he asked for somebody to help him learn to read better and stuff, and she took it upon herself to do it. Now, all I had at first was her name, Mary Clark Wells. I couldn't find her. I did find out that she had eventually moved to Chicago, and I found a little bit about her on Ancestry. But I was with my friend Gail at Brenanthan Library, and she was researching something in the Baltimore church records there. And here is a pad of paper. Mary Wells Clark wrote down her whole experience with having met him and what she taught him and what she did with him over the years, even after she left the plantation and went back to Chicago.
Wow.
So it was like the second Swedenborgian coincidence, which wasn't a coincidence.
Yeah. Did she also expose him to Swedenborg, or she just taught him to read?
No, taught him to read, but she accidentally left one of the Swedenborgian books out, and he picked it up and became very interested in it and thought it was better than the Methodist book he was supposed to learn. But she assured him, that he needed to stay where he was because he had a good job and stuff like that. So he did. But later on, he would move to Washington, D.C. when the Jim Crow laws really started getting bad. And he could no longer act as a minister they just eliminated everything like that. So he's in D.C. and takes over a Methodist Episcopal church and goes out and finds the Swedenborgians in the city.
Okay. So what year is this? Give me a sense
What's
of the
this?
time.
1890s.
Okay, okay.
But
So Helen she was 10 years old around then. Okay.
yeah, yeah.
So there were quite a few Swedenborgians in DC at that time.
So some of them got very interested in it, and they came and worked with his congregation a little bit, and he decided to bring the whole congregation into the Swedenborgian church, and that became the first Black Swedenborgian church in the United States.
Okay. So they converted, the whole congregation converted.
The whole church did.
Which was a thing. That was also how the Freiburg New Church started. He
Right.
was a Congregationalist, and yeah, there was a lot of
Yeah.
that sort of changing
Stuff
hands.
going on. Yeah.
Interesting. Okay. So that was
Yeah.
in
So
DC.
other interesting thing of it is that his name was Reverend Peter Carter Lewis.
Okay.
Now, Carter is an important Swedenborgian name.
Yeah.
Because Robert Carter III was the great emancipator in Virginia. He freed 500 slaves over 40 years. And I tried to tackle whether he or his father were freed by him. There's some circumstantial evidence that it's true.
It's possible.
But not enough that I can say for sure. But once again, it's another Swedenborgian coincidence.
Yeah. And are there any sermons of his or anything? I'm so curious. It'd be so interesting to hear what he took from Swedenborg and what he was preaching.
Unfortunately, there's no
It's all
record of this
lost.
stuff.
Yeah.
That never got recorded.
Sure.
But when he left the church, which is in the book, and I won't go into that, Reverend James E. Thomas came and took over, and he was not born in slavery, but he was a young man about the age of 13 when he moved with his family to Boston. And he was walking on the street one day and came across the book room.
Okay. On Newbury Street?
Uh-huh.
Or was it somewhere else at that time? Okay, it was on
I
Newbury
don't
Street?
know exactly where it was. I picture Newbury Street because I don't know anything else. So he went in and started talking to the people. Now he's 13 years old. So he's borrowing books and taking them home and reading them. Reverend Reed at the time was the president of the theological school.
Okay. Sure.
And he started talking to this young man when he was there and reviewing things. And then he found that this young man not only knew typing, but he was a trained stenographer. So he became Reed's assistant. And so he got really familiar with the whole convention and everything that was going on. And he became the first actual Black student at the theological school.
Okay. That was one of my finds when I was at the Swedenborg Chapel in Cambridge, were boxes of James Reed's sermons in the basement.
Yeah.
They're being archived right now, I think, at Harvard University. So hopefully we'll have access to them at some point. But okay, so he was the first to go through the New Church Theological School.
3 years. I don't know that he actually got a diploma. He had enough language background, but he was there for 3 years and then went to the DC church. What had happened at the DC church, and this is where I want to talk about racism.
Yeah.
Okay, because when the Black church, the white church wanted them to become a part of Maryland Association. Maryland Association said the only way they could do that is if they had a white advisory board. So they got a white advisory board, and they also were not allowed to touch any money. So the white advisory board decides that what they need is a better building, and it should be a neighborhood house like Hull House. Now remember that this first minister was a former slave, and I mean, he was not up on all these new ideas. He just wanted to have a Swedenborgian church. During this process, before they built the big building, they reconstructed the church where he had been preaching and built a concrete 30 by 20-foot building, which for him would have been just fine. That he just needed a better place to meet. But the advisory committee decided that they needed to build a Hull House. So I feel like there was no conversation going on here.
Yeah.
The advisory committee knew this new trend was going on, and they wanted to be in this trend.
But that wasn't necessarily his calling.
Yeah, it was not his calling at all. And in fact, he left the church just as that building was finished because he was not able to do what they wanted him to do.
And and I know a bit about Hull House, but tell me a little more about the vision of what that would have been.
Okay, what their vision was to have industrial education, to to teach Black people things that would get them employed.
Which is awesome, but it's also, if it's not your vision or your calling and you wanna
Right.
just be a church and have a church building, it's a
Yeah,
whole
yeah.
other endeavor.
It's a
Yeah.
whole other endeavor.
Yeah.
Where Reverend Thomas, when he came, he was all up for that. So he did really well with it, and they had classes for kids, and they did a wonderful job. But the problem was when the first minister was there, when he left, the the members of the church were loyal to him.
Yeah.
So that's why when he changed it to a Swedenborgian church, they followed him, not because they were Swedenborgians, but
Yeah.
because they believed in him.
Sure.
So when he left, almost all the adults left.
Did it ever grow back again under anyone's leadership, or was that kind of the
It
beginning of the decline?
it was the beginning of the downhill. They had a wonderful children's program. They had like 200 children that they educated over the next 4 years. And actually, Reverend Thomas really got frustrated over not being able to work with adults at all. He didn't mind doing children, but he did teach and preach at other Black churches all over DC. He was like a very important member of the Black ministry in Washington, DC. And he would later go on to um, speak at large Black rallies of sometimes 1,000 people.
Interesting.
He
Any
was
records of his talks?
No, although they may be, like
Yeah. This
that
is what we're
that
praying will still come out of the woodworks, yeah.
yeah, but he quite an interesting man.
Yeah.
So,
I was
yeah,
just curious. I mean, I think you're bringing up of this dynamic of the white advisory committee and the Black church. In your research, did it seem like, was there integration? Like, were these people coming to convention? Was there segregation? What was the dynamic between this
yeah,
Black
that
community and the rest of
well,
convention?
Board of Missions did pay for the neighborhood house, but then when Reverend Thomas resigned and he went on to become a missionary in Alabama,
Hmm.
which is where his family was from, which is why he originally went to theological school. He just sort of took the DC jobs because he felt responsible for having gotten rid of the theological school. So he did it as a favor, but he really wanted to go to Alabama.
And he was a Swedenborgian missionary in Alabama?
Yes.
Interesting. Interesting.
Yeah.
Okay.
And he worked with Booker T. Washington.
Okay.
So that's a really exciting thing.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm curious what that missionary work was like. And again, this is a little later now. Are we into the 1900s now, or
Yes, in the early
this is
1900s.
the early
Yeah.
1900s? So
Yeah.
Helen would have left. She wouldn't be in Alabama anymore. She was sort of up in the East by then
Right,
with
right.
school.
Yes. Yeah.
Um,
But about the time that she was getting active, and another minister also was an Alabama missionary. He was a very educated and intellectual man who had
yeah.
come originally from the Caribbean,
Uh-huh.
and it's a bit of a complicated story, but he was also an Alabama missionary during that same time period, but I don't see that they ever connected, which is sort
Interesting.
of sad.
Yeah.
But he was highly intellectual. He spoke
Mhm.
4 languages. He taught at at the Methodist Episcopal Theological School, but he really wanted to be was a Swedenborgian.
Mhm.
So he
Mhm.
left there, and he would teach at different Bible schools, and he was sort of an open minister, like,
Mhm.
he would go any place and preach, and
Yeah.
and he felt like just because he didn't have a signboard that said Swedenborgian didn't mean he wasn't teaching Swedenborgian
Mhm.
ideas.
Mhm. There were quite a few, I mean, and across, within the white community too, of people
Right.
who saw the call of the new church as this vital thing that needed to be shared and expressed, but were less concerned about the branding. We're speaking in the Unitarian church or there
Yeah.
was a lot of that energy at the time. Not all of them were supported by convention because there
They
was sort
were
of
not
backlash.
because
Yeah.
they didn't because
Yes,
they
yes.
didn't
They weren't
they
really pulling people in, they were just lighting them up to go off and do their
right,
work when
to
they
be of
were.
use.
Yeah,
So they neither of them wound up getting any missionary money.
they didn't get any support
No,
at
no,
all.
no,
Wow.
no.
So what was the string at that point? What were they receiving from the church or the denomination? Anything? They were
Uh,
sending reports to the messenger, so you have this
yes, they
information?
continued to send reports to the
Yeah,
messenger,
yeah.
for, like, amazingly, like,
Mhm,
they were being totally ignored. Reverend
mhm,
Thomas, when he got there, the church building had been sold in DC,
mhm,
and it was put in a fund for colored people, work with
mhm,
colored people. And so he had hoped to be able to go and start one of these neighborhood houses in Alabama,
mhm.
but there wasn't any white people to be an advisory committee. So he got nowhere. He got no funding from it.
Wow,
It was
wow.
just sat in the trust funds of convention for
Mhm.
probably 50 years.
Did it Did it ever I mean, my first question wants to be, when did we abolish these advisory committees and recognize the insanity of that? But then at least my understanding is there haven't been any other Black congregations. Like, it just kind of ended? I mean, what was the.
Well, goes on for a few years. That was there for 50 years.
Oh,
50 years, and
okay.
all I could ever find about it was one sentence in
Mm,
convention reports from the Illinois Association.
mhm.
Now, it existed for 50 years. There's no
So there
record
was
of it.
there was no communication, or
No,
they were just sort of
no, and he
independent?
received it no financial aid, but he
Mm,
did get the branding.
mhm, mhm.
He did call it a Swedenborgian.
Interesting, interesting.
So that's another really interesting story, which I hope somebody follows up on.
Yeah, to find out more. Well, and I mean, certainly today there still are independent African American
Right,
churches who
right,
are
right.
sort of
So he was
tangentially
the
connected.
first one,
Yeah.
and
We do have a question that just came in about what happened to the money which was earmarked for Black churches or for colored
well,
people,
for about 5 years, Reverend Thomas did get $15 a year.
which was more than, but still not a
Well,
lot.
it
Yeah.
was more than, but still not enough to live
Not
on.
enough.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. And then I don't know, just sort of disappeared. I do
Mhm.
remember Gladys told me that at one point she saw a folder in the drawers. Remember when the theological school was in Boston, they had wonderful archival stuff. And you
Mhm.
could read through all I loved going there for meetings.
Yeah.
But
Mhm.
anyway, she found this folder that said for the colored people. So it
Mm.
was still there and the money was still sitting there.
Interesting.
So
But
I
maybe
don't
just.
know whatever actually happened to it. It
Yeah.
wasn't a lot of money by that time, but
Sure.
it was still there and
Sure.
nothing had been
Mhm.
done with it.
So that one church in DC was the only church that really did have for a while, until it sounds like things didn't go great,
Right.
have kind of a formal connection. with
where
convention, or were there others that had formal connections?
yes, there is later on. There
Okay.
is later on.
Okay.
We'll jump ahead a bit. Gladys's grandfather,
Okay.
Reverend Weems, had it's amazing to think of this now. He had a church in North Cambridge that had 300 Black members. Can you imagine that?
Mhm.
300 Black members.
Mm.
But he was still very much under the financial control of white people.
Sure, sure. So was he a graduate of the theological school?
Yes,
He
he was.
was. And you said his father as well, so he was the 2nd minister?
No, he was the first
He was the 1st, okay.
first in that family.
Mhm, mhm.
So he had been to the theological school. He went to the theological school because he wrote an essay and won a scholarship
To the school?
to the school.
Interesting. Do we
And
have a copy of that?
no, oh, I wish I had that one.
Right.
Anyway,
Uh-huh,
so he made phone and mail
uh-huh.
discussions with Reverend Wooster
Sure.
and came on the train to meet him. And apparently, Reverend Wooster didn't realize he was Black
Interesting.
because they were the last two people on the train station on the platform. And then
Oh,
Reverend Wooster introduced himself and said,
mhm,
"You must be
mhm. Yeah,
Samuel Weems." And
mhm,
he said, "Yes." And then he went on and took his family and let them live with him. So
okay.
their household actually had two of their own under 5-year-old kids there and two of Weems's under 5-year-olds.
Interesting. And
And
was
then
Gladys one of those 5-year-olds?
no, no,
No.
this was her grandfather.
This was her grandfather. Okay, okay.
Okay. So he did finish school and
Mhm.
opened this church in,
And grew it to 300 members.
yes, up quickly. Quick.
Mhm,
Unfortunately, it got to its height right at the start of the Depression,
mhm,
and
mhm.
then it all fell apart because um, people don't realize the Depression was really bad for white people. Basically, 15 to 20% unemployment.
Yeah.
Unemployment for Black people was over 50%. So these people that were either in lower middle class or maybe middle class all lost their jobs. You
Mhm.
know, it became just a disaster. He was encouraged by Leslie Marshall, minister, to look farther and wound up near the end of his time in North Cambridge doing some mile trip and visiting Black historic colleges and
Hmm,
giving speeches and doing papers and all those
mhm,
things. He wound up getting fired though
mm,
because his church had fallen apart
mhm.
and convention had no vision other than a congregation
Yeah.
as a minister.
Mhm,
But you can
mhm.
imagine that at this time, in our modern times, we had Eric who went around and helped churches.
Sure.
Like if
Mhm.
that had been available, we would have a lot of Black members.
Right.
We
There'd
would
been
have
some
a
way
lot
to
of
think
Black
about
members.
it.
Yeah.
Yeah, and there was no collaboration between the North Cambridge Church and the Swedenborg Chapel in Cambridge or the Boston Church because they all
The,
existed at that point.
the Swedenborg Chapel, the people were very supportive of it.
They were. Oh, that's cool to
They
hear.
were Mass
Massachusetts people.
Baptist Association did
Yeah.
help fund his
Okay.
church. In the long run, it disappeared because they had
Yeah.
no vision beyond a church ministry.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, but that's his life is a really interesting story.
Yeah. And that was Gladys's grandfather, so
That was
clearly it
Gladys Grid.
continued
Yes.
to her. Did her father have a connection as well?
No, her
No?
her
Mhm.
parents were divorced. Gladys's parents were divorced, and her mother was Reverend Weems's daughter.
I see.
And
Okay. Mhm.
there was a church formed in Harlem,
Oh, okay.
and the first minister died after about 5 years. And Gladys's stepfather, Reverend Fairfax, became the minister at that time.
Mhm.
And his wife died,
Hmm.
and he remarried Gladys's mother.
So there was
So,
another congregation in Harlem that was a part of
yes,
Horse. This was another Black congregation in
that
Harlem, connected
yeah,
to convention,
yes,
supported by convention?
yes,
No?
somewhat,
Yeah. Yeah.
somewhat, you know.
This was later on. This is in the into the
This was in the 30s and 40s.
30s and 40s. Okay.
Yes.
Okay. And kinda lived and then died? Or how long did the church in Harlem live?
It pretty much died during the Depression, the same
Mhm.
reason, because
Mhm.
the middle class in New York City left for the suburbs
Mhm. Mhm.
because there were jobs there, and there
Yeah,
were no longer jobs for Black
in the
people
city.
in New York
Mhm.
City.
Mhm.
So
Right.
that sort of finished it off
So
there.
lots of these urban centers, Chicago, Harlem, DC,
Yes.
Boston. Is there another one that is that
Well,
the
3 3 urban churches were in North Cambridge, Chicago, and Harlem. And after that, there was there was not really any Black churches
Mhm.
or Black ministers. Gladys was ordained, can't remember, 80, I think 1980, but that was not long after Dorothea was the first woman ordained.
Right.
So she had 2 things against her. I mean, she was both a woman and a Black woman.
Yeah.
So unfortunately, there were a lot of problems,
Mhm. Mhm.
and I interviewed her several different times, and she has decided that she wants to write her own autobiography.
That would be
So,
great.
well, I did include some articles in the book that had been in the Messenger,
Mhm.
but I decided that I wasn't gonna tell her story if she wants to
Sure.
do it.
Yeah, sure. She should definitely tell her own story.
Yeah.
And I appreciate that way you're helping to tell these stories of those who can no longer tell their story. And I like your insight. If we'd had a little more vision, we could have had more Black members and more Black
Yeah,
communities. And were
exactly.
there ever and all of these this was all happening in a time of kind of pretty strong segregation. There was a Black church or there was a white church.
We're not.
Nowadays they were yeah, there were neither the twain shall meet.
And that was one of the problems. We had no way of introducing it in
Yeah.
when Gladys was ready to minister.
Yeah.
There was no example of that ever having happened.
Yeah.
So she bumped up into a lot of issues,
Yeah.
both from her. I would say that some of that was her own thoughts about her grandfather being fired.
Mm, mhm. Mhm.
Sort of had an attitude issue because of that.
Which is not surprising. I mean, the story you're telling is there's support, but there's this oversight
Yes,
and this white oversight, and then not a lot of listening,
right,
and then pulling the plug. Yeah, that
right.
all of these with a lot of success, 300 people,
Well,
and
yes,
somebody
yes,
converting his whole Methodist congregation to Swedenborgianism. I mean, these could have been real moments of celebration. I wonder
exactly.
and I mean, I know there are other churches at the time were also bigger than they are today, but is your sense that actually both of these communities were maybe I mean, I don't know that the Swedenborg Chapel ever had 300 members
Right.
in Cambridge. I wonder if that was one of the dynamics of I don't know,
It's
I mean,
yeah,
Black
it's
culture definitely does church maybe a little more, uh,
yes, yes,
they're a little more committed to the model maybe than
right,
others.
but busy.
Yeah,
They did a lot of social programming. They had all kinds of programs going on all the time. They had speakers all the time. It's an amazing story.
that's really cool. We have another comment too from one of our
Okay.
attendees. This is Robert in San Pedro, and he wrote that he had several members of the Harlem Church as parishioners when I was a minister in New York City from
Uh-huh.
1989 to 2003. So he may have some more information about that
Oh, that's
community.
good.
That's
Yeah,
very cool.
I will talk to you about that.
Yeah, yeah.
Um,
So where does this take us now?
where it takes us now
Yeah.
is we have Corey, who was not ready to discuss his ministry because he still feels like he's at the beginning.
Mhm.
And I would hope that with this book we have learned, and that his pathway will be improved because of it.
Mhm.
Uh,
What are some of the learnings? I mean, we've mentioned a few. What would you like people to learn from this history?
communication.
Communication.
Communication is the issue, you
Mhm.
know? Um, and that's the problem with racism now, you know, is white people don't talk to black people don't talk to white people.
Mhm.
Um,
Mhm.
and it it leads to all kinds of problems. I work on that a lot.
Yeah.
Since because I don't drive anymore, I'm dependent on bus and public transportation.
Mhm.
Lots of times I am the only white person on the bus. And I go out of my way to talk to people on the bus.
Mhm. Mhm.
Some people want to, some people don't, and I'm fine with
Mhm.
that. But
Mhm.
I try every day when I pass people in downtown Cincinnati, whether they're white or black, I say hello,
Mhm. Mhm.
and try and open communication.
Mhm.
And that I think that is the long-term answer for solving this racism problem.
Yeah. Mhm. And recognizing the barriers to communication, and it sounds like
Yeah,
from what some of what you shared that the insider and the outsider mentality, those who are making the rules and giving out the money, those were the white people. And so the communication is kind of one-sided. We will
yeah.
tell you what to do. We
Well,
will
and
instead of really I'm always remembering listening is just as important as speaking when it comes to maybe more important when it comes to
yeah,
communication.
and
Yeah.
some black friends, and they say, black people are hesitant to talk to white people.
Yeah.
So
Mm,
so I'm not sure how we get past that,
yeah.
except as individuals to try and talk to each other.
Sure.
Just
Yeah,
and we are in a difficult, very difficult time right now.
we are.
Like I said, we've lost a lot of the progress we made up through 1980. It The laws are being dismantled, DEI is being dismantled. I know a lot of us are trying to fight against that. But
Yeah.
in the meantime, opportunities for
Yeah.
people are just disappearing. And the level of racism
Mm,
is increasing tremendously
mhm. It's becoming
because
very visible and active and
because
mhm,
it's all right
mhm,
to be racist now.
mhm, mhm. Yeah. Yeah.
And
We
I
have a
think
question coming in about are there any denominations today that are doing well in terms of diversity?
yes, there are some programs in some churches that are doing well,
Mhm.
but I
Mhm.
think overall white churches are still white, black
Yeah.
churches are still black.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, and it's just a division. Like you said, we know there's black Swedenborgian churches, but we don't have any association with them.
Mhm.
And I don't know if convention could choose to do something about that or not.
Mhm.
Um, but it certainly would be worth somebody at least going to talk to them.
Sure. Sure. I got to interview Ron Schnarr about a year ago. He's gone to join one of the black congregations in Louisville, and he's
I
so
know
moved by
about that congregation,
yeah,
and I think that's great. But
yeah,
that's the only one that I know that
yeah.
has had any contact.
Right now, yeah.
Yeah.
And there's certainly, I mean, speaking of all the denominations, there are beacons. I think of like Glide Memorial Church in San Francisco is a very
Right.
diverse community. Like there are certainly highlights that stand out. I don't know that
Yeah.
there's a denomination that, has dealt with it denomination wide, but in certain areas and communities where there is that diversity, it does exist and it can exist.
Uh, yeah, I think there are individual churches
Yeah.
in all different denominations that
Yeah.
have worked hard at it.
Yeah.
And I would say that Shada Sullivan in the Wilmington church
Yeah.
has made a big difference. They have been inviting the community in to have meetings, and that was my church for 25 years.
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
we had no black people. But
Mhm.
now if you watch the services from the Wilmington church, there's people of other colors there.
There's a little bit more diversity coming in. Uh,
Yes, yes, and it's just wonderful.
yeah.
So I think in a lot of denominations, there's these individual churches that are working and actively going out.
Is your sense of what the work is that they're doing that's helping?
Well,
Yep.
I think the Wilmington church, what really happened is they started inviting their community. They live
Mhm.
in a highly Black area,
Yeah. Yeah.
and just inviting community
Mhm.
groups to come
Mhm.
meet there
Mhm.
and going out and
Mhm.
being in public with them
Mhm.
and, just trying to be more open.
Yeah. Putting that hand out to reach out and
Yeah.
name the welcome. Yeah.
Yeah, but it's not a fast thing, it's not gonna change overnight,
Yeah.
but, I still would say that communication is the
Mhm.
biggest thing.
Mhm.
People talking to other people,
Yeah.
not just as an official person, but just
Mhm.
individually. We
Being
can
in
all
relationship, right, being in real relationship, and that's from what you share about these churches from the past, it does feel like there's a lot of isolation, which,
yes.
I still sort of perceive that we have some isolation in our community. We could do some with some more communication.
Well, I didn't talk about Donna. We had another Black woman minister after
Mhm.
Gladys, Donna
Okay.
Sloan, and I did try and get in touch with her, but
Yeah.
she doesn't wanna be in touch.
Yeah.
And she did go on and become a Presbyterian missionary
Mhm.
in Africa
Mm.
for a while, and she wrote a couple interesting papers about the race issue. So that's very interesting, and she described it before she left that she felt there was quiet racism
Mm.
in the
Mhm.
denomination. And
Mhm.
I say in the book, and I say out loud to people, I think it's more than quiet racism.
Yeah.
I think there's a large undercurrent of
Yeah.
racism in the denomination. And as I've worked on this project, I have felt that from some people. Like,
Yeah.
why are you wasting your time doing this?
Mhm.
You could be
Mhm.
doing other things.
Well, I think that's what we've come to discover is you gotta be anti-racist. There's no middle ground.
No middle ground, just because you're not saying it out loud
Mm.
doesn't.
And if you're agitated by someone saying it out loud, then that's maybe a sign. I mean, it's very resonant with the regeneration journey. It's like we all have evil in us. Like it's nobody gets
Right,
out of this
right,
human journey perfect, but are we willing to look at it and see it
right.
and
And
name it?
and
Yeah.
and when we see it, we need to call it out to the person. Not necessarily in public, but at
Mm.
least say something to
Mhm.
them.
Mhm. Mhm.
And I haven't, but I think I would at this convention coming up. I just think that the people should consider
Yeah.
what their attitude is.
And when you think about this silent racism, do you perceive it in individuals? Do you perceive it as embedded in some of our sort of systems or our
Both.
of operation? Both. Yeah. Anything you might want to say about what what that might be, and especially in terms of systems, because that does feel like an area where action could be taken.
Yeah. It Well, I would say that Chris Barber has received wonderful when
Mhm.
he goes.
Mhm.
I'm not sure Corey has received that much.
Oh, interesting. So you do see it actively against certain individuals.
I absolutely do because he's such a historian, you know,
Yeah.
and we work together on stuff.
Mm.
But I'm not sure Corey has felt that
Has the
kind of
same
support.
response.
I don't know. I haven't talked to him about it.
Yeah. And whether that's an issue of race or
Or
I mean,
just personalities,
or just
like
somebody
we
being
all have,
different.
yeah, we all have different personalities. So it's not necessarily a racism thing,
Yeah.
like,
Yeah.
uh,
Well, so much richness. And when you're with your work with SAR, what can you share about what SAR is doing right now or what you've been learning in that
well,
addressing of things
we've
now?
been talking this spring
Mhm.
about other kinds of racism, not
Mm.
black and white,
Yep.
because the majority of people being picked up by ICE
Yeah.
are
Sure.
Hispanic,
Latin American.
and that's going to be a focus of
Yeah.
the group at convention
Mhm.
this year. That statistically, it's a big thing. It's
Yeah.
a
And that's
deal.
another community that has not been well represented in convention
Integrated.
in
Yes,
any kind of
exactly.
way. Mhm. I know when I've spoken with people sometimes about these issues, the intellectual nature of Swedenborgianism has come up, that this is one of the barriers to it being received by all communities. Do you see any barriers inherent in the Swedenborgian tradition itself, or the theological tradition?
Well, I
Yeah.
think definitely Reverend Daniels, the very intellectual Alabama missionary, was
Yeah.
able to speak.
Yeah.
He wound up working with farmers,
Hmm.
and he worked with George Washington Carver in
Yeah.
Alabama, also at Tuskegee. But he brought a lot of, uneducated people to
Yeah.
Swedenborgian ideas.
Yeah.
So it's not that
No.
we can't
Hmm.
talk to people where
Yeah.
they are.
Wherever
You
they
know,
are. Hmm.
shouldn't have to be an intellectual elite to be
Hmm.
a Swedenborgian,
Yeah. Yeah.
that to teach somebody about the value of being of use,
Hmm.
you don't need a high IQ to understand being
Sure.
of use.
Yeah. Well, and we can be an intellectual tradition and be attractive to intellectual people of all races. Like it's not like
Right,
we have the
right.
cornerstone in that.
Yeah, there's nothing wrong with that. But
Yeah.
but, we need to maybe work a little harder about
Yeah.
being less focused on the intellectual.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and more focused on that communication, as you said. How are we
Yeah.
really building? How is this faith that we're coming to understand being lived? And how are
Right.
we living it in a way that's creating more unity between each other? I like your suggestion of just talking to each other, just being in relationship with people who are different from us is, to me, a vital part of being the new church. It's not just
Mhm.
about congregational growth. It's rooting out this sense of separation. What do you think congregations and individuals really can do? Because I hear you saying we need to communicate, but it does feel like we need to learn to communicate almost.
You know,
What's that learning? What's that feels vital to you right now, and to the SAR group?
I would say, we have what color you are, you're still having familiar stuff. Your families are still going through the same
Yeah.
things, and discussing that with people, is not race related.
Mhm.
We all are trying to live in this society with all its issues right now. If you're a parent and you see somebody else who's a parent and they're of a
Mhm.
different race, they're
Mhm.
still going to have the same kinds of issues you're having.
Yeah.
How do we raise our kids to be good people? How do we deal with their schooling? But if you've never talked to a person of a different race, that can feel intimidating.
Mhm.
So I don't know if there's a way we could practice how to do that.
But it's part of what's needed. My radar certainly goes off hearing some of the history and this dynamic of oversight and telling, which
Right.
feels like a very patriarchal kind of
It is very,
energy. So
yeah,
it has harm on a level of racial diversity, but I think it probably has harm in terms of gender and all kinds of other
right,
things.
right.
And I
Yeah,
think that's an area where I would love to see our denomination start to bring change, where there's more for listening. And
right,
even the way kind of grants are given, it's sort of like you apply and then you get this money and maybe you'll get it next year. Like there's not as much relationship between the doers, the people who are called to share the message and then the ones who are kind of holding the purse strings. And I think there's sort of a historical view of, well, they need to be separate so that there's checks and balances or whatever.
right,
But there's got to be some increased relationship,
yes,
communication. What are you really called to do? Um,
right,
Instead of making demands, and probably whatever that group is of who are doing, they need to know things about racism, know things about bias,
right.
and I think our theology is very conducive to that kind of work because it's about letting the evils be exposed, trusting that that's a part of the regenerative process. And it's certainly what gives me some degree of hope about this political moment is that maybe we're not becoming more racist as a society, but the racism that's always been here is being more exposed.
I think that that's true. I don't think this
Yeah.
is more racist than it's ever been. the racist people are feeling more comfortable in being
Emboldened.
out in the open,
And
and
they're in positions of power to do harm.
they're in
So in that
position
way, it's
to do
yeah,
harm. Right,
yeah, yeah. I like to believe if there was a black church in DC today, Rich would be hanging out with them. Like there'd be communication, there'd be collaboration. Like so, just thinking about our time versus that time, there is more unity. There is for those who are ready for it. Like there is
right,
more connection and communication than there was. We haven't completely gone backwards, but the racism that's always been there is now kind of coming out sideways and which ways and in all kinds of
right,
destructive
right.
ways that it was sort
Yeah,
of polite
and
racism back then. Yeah. And
yeah,
people
so
stayed in their lane, right? And
yeah,
whereas
and
now there's an expectation that we all be treated equal, and
right,
that's really being tested.
responsibility, I think,
Yeah.
for our own attitude
Yeah.
and maybe go out of our way a little
Yeah.
to be more inclusive in our own lives,
Yeah. Yeah.
not just as an organization. And
Mhm.
the only way the organization is gonna change is if individuals change.
Well, and I like what you brought up about the Wilmington church, that it's recognizing if you have a church in a building in a community, then you are a part of that community.
Right,
And to not
exactly,
sort of see yourself as set apart, which I think has been a temptation. It's probably a temptation for lots of churches to we'll just do
just
our thing over here.
go group and
Yeah.
we'll just and,
Mhm.
all will be well.
Yeah.
Um, as opposed to going out and saying, like,
Yeah.
"Come in, we would
We're
like
here.
you to join us. We're
I
here.
think
You're welcome."
yeah. Well, and if you think about it, like, especially if a building has been there for 100 years, like, we don't own it. Like, we might be the members who have fiscal responsibility over it, but I always think that some of those churches, it's like the community owns it on some spiritual level. Like,
Yeah,
it's a part of the community,
right,
and thinking in new ways about how it can be used and how it can support the life of the community. And in so doing, share the message of the new church and
right.
embody it with one another. So there's hope, but it sounds like there's work to do. And
Really,
yeah,
'cause we're
yeah,
definitely and
yeah.
becoming more legally racist than we
Mhm,
were.
mhm,
Certainly, the 80s legally were much better than the situation right now,
mhm.
and it's painful to realize that,
Yeah.
um, but it's also male female,
Mhm,
like
mhm,
women have lost their rights, you
mhm,
know,
mhm.
and LGBTQ people are
Yeah,
losing rights that they had gained.
yeah.
And it's just all we need to be more interactive with all kinds of people.
Mhm,
But one of the things that I noticed is that racism comes up more in this country when there's economic problems. We get tribal. I would hope that we as Swedenborgians
mhm,
can use our intellect,
mhm, mhm.
which I sometimes have a problem with us being so intellect, but
Sure.
we are.
Mhm,
So we
mhm,
need to work hard
mhm, mhm.
to not let this tribal stuff happen.
Yeah,
We can
yeah,
choose to not do that.
yeah. Well, and to me, that feels so central to the vision of the new church. It's the holy city where all
Right,
of the tribes come together and we're all
right,
mingling. And that's one of my questions I'm always sitting with is, okay, if we are the new church and we're all mingling in the holy city, how's that going? How are we doing this? How are we all getting along? How are we coexisting in peace? I think we are and we're not. Like in that, and
right,
this moment really feels like a heaven and hell moment. Like I feel like you on that bus with all, all you know I live in a very diverse neighborhood. Like there's a lot of places where it is heaven and we really do get along and we really do see
right,
each other's humanity, and then in the same moment there can be hell and there can
right.
be division, and as you say, it's that fear and economic insecurity that really stirs it up, stirs the pot up,
Yeah,
because we want to retract to what is known. And it does feel like for members of the Swedenborgian Church, the spiritual invitation is to step into the unknown. Don't go
right,
back. Don't retract. Don't give
right.
into that fear, but open up and keep moving forward. Because That's our charge, right? The new heaven and the new earth, as Helen declared.
Yes,
It's what we're
yes, exactly.
that's what we're well, I feel like I've learned so much from this, and I'm excited to read your book and hear more. I can already sense you're gonna publish that book and you're gonna get some new synchronistic bit of information probably a week later.
Manuscript
I'm
in
sure.
just 2 weeks ago.
I'm sure.
So what I do plan on doing is to have a website and add
Good.
new information as it comes
Great.
along because,
Great.
like, I just did the surface stuff, and
Yeah.
I hope that not only will I find out more, but somebody in the future will come back
Yeah.
and find out about this 50-year congregation in Chicago.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because where they were meeting for church, I forgot to include this, where they were meeting for church in Chicago during the Chicago riots
Mhm.
during the Red Summer of 1919, the
Mhm.
worst of the rioting was right around that building.
Mm.
But an
Mhm.
interesting thing about that is the black people took a stand at that corner and fought
Mhm.
back. And
Mm.
I'm like, okay, that's interesting.
Yeah. Well, and I want to talk to Robert about the members of the Harlem Church. Like, I'm just real curious. I think one other thing I'm really curious about is what does it mean to be a Swedenborgian? What are the ideas of the new church that are really resonating and alive? And what drew these 300 people to North Cambridge? So I'm sad we don't have sermons from him and from that time, but maybe there are some. Maybe
Well,
he's
we
part of.
we have
Okay.
at
Okay.
the theological school, and they're supposed to be sorting it out at
Okay.
this time.
Okay. Cool. So
And
maybe that'll be the
I'm
next version of
actually,
your book.
he actually would really like to go out and
Yeah.
go through those
Yeah.
because he had all these articles and speeches that he gave at these historic black colleges.
Yeah.
And I can't imagine why we couldn't recover those and
Yeah.
use them as a basis of a new program.
Yeah, for sure, for sure. Yeah, that would fascinate me to read some of those.
Yes.
Very rich. The history is a rich trove of information for today as we step into the future. Well, it's been so good to be with you. We have 9 of you. I'm sorry we can't see you in cyberspace, but I'm so glad you're listening and watching along. If there are
And
any remaining questions, feel free to put them in the
yes.
chat. I will be releasing this as a podcast next Tuesday. So if you are here and you want to share the conversation with other friends and family, you can do that. It'll be published on our Helen Keller Collaborative YouTube page and also on my Substack, Worship is Life. Okay, big question. I knew there were going to be more. It seems as though it would take a denomination led intentional effort to break down racial barriers, such as the Seventh day Adventist Church did to become one of the most racially diverse religious groups in the US. Through a combination of intentional evangelism to marginalized groups post Civil War, a global theology emphasizing universality, and the development of regional conferences that empowered Black leadership. They did this while navigating a segregated structure. Do you think the SCNA might ever follow such a path? I'm going to let you take that one, Sue. What do you
Okay.
think?
Well, DC got
Mhm.
sold. Reverend Thomas, I told you before, he in the DC circle of churches.
Mhm.
And the Seventh-day Adventists were looking at starting a neighborhood house, and I expect he spoke to them about them not having to create their own, that one existed. So, but the advisory group says out of nowhere, the Seventh-day Adventists came and offered to buy the building. Again,
Mhm.
not acknowledging the fact that Reverend Thomas would have been looking for somebody to take over because he
Mhm.
had taught these kids for 5 years. He
Mhm.
wouldn't have just disappeared and
Yeah.
left them hanging.
Yeah.
I mean, I just can't believe he would do that.
Yeah.
And at first, there was no record of who had bought the building. But then
Mhm.
when I found it, again, one of those Swedenborgian coincidences, when I found out who had bought it and that they continued for another 30 years to run this neighborhood house,
Mhm.
teaching the Black children
Mhm.
how to get along in society.
Mhm.
And their building was in the worst neighborhood in Washington, DC. So these
Mhm.
kids were really without help from anybody, they
Mm.
wouldn't have made it. But it's interesting, it was the Seventh-day
An
Adventists.
interesting synchronicity in their efforts and in their work, and I
They
guess
had
I would take a stab at answering that question if the SCNA would ever take on such a project. At this point, I would say no. That part of the ethos of the Swedenborgian Church is radical freedom, and we're having this powerful conversation and naming that anti-racism is at the heart of the vision of the new church. I don't know that every Swedenborgian would agree with that statement.
uh,
I
I
hope to
would say
God
those
they would.
words.
That's been part
Um,
of the way we functioned is we have groups that come up and do good works like the Social Justice Committee, SAR. We've put forward proposals from, on the floor of convention. And there's always a stipulation at the end for divergence. Like we
right,
believe this and we honor that everyone follow their own path. And I'm
right,
sure to put such an effort, it also we'd have to all be on the same page, and
right.
put together the funding. And that's sort of the radical mystery of Swedenborgians. We don't always like to be on the same page with each other.
Exactly so. Yeah,
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah.
So it's certainly part of why I hope with the Helen Keller Collaborative is that we can sort of be more radically forward thinking in those areas because she was clear on her stance and so we can
Right.
be clear on ours. But it is a thing to come together as a denomination with a shared priority that this is what we're going
Yes,
to do.
the equitable at this point.
Mm,
The
mhm.
support
Yeah.
that may or may not be agreed to by 100% of the members.
Yeah.
I feel that there's much more hope
Yeah.
that we don't have to be everybody in convention be 100%
Yeah.
behind what we do.
Yeah, but if we can have that improved communication, we can empower those who are called to move in a certain direction to
Right,
hopefully move
right.
in those directions. That's my sense too, and that's my hope that I think
Yeah,
we don't have part of the challenge of a denomination is we all have right. We don't want to have that sense of everybody has to do it the same way, but to resonate more with the vision of the new church that we follow our unique callings and we support each other. That's the missing link. We follow
yes,
our separate callings and we communicate and we support each other. Well, I say I don't think we could do it now, but I don't know about tomorrow. Maybe tomorrow will be
right.
different. Like I like to believe there's a movement and we're in a time of chaos and change and the old models that had worked for a time are not always working. So it does seem like there's a little more openness to trying new things and addressing the real issues of the day.
And just simply having things like this where
Yeah.
we're
Yeah.
openly,
Yeah.
acknowledging that we're not perfect in this area, but we can move. We can choose to do better.
Yes, we can. And it
And
seems like when we're members of the new church, and that
right,
means it's always being made new. And
right.
it's okay if we haven't quite gotten there yet because
Yes,
it's descending. And to me, that feels like a further hopeful aspect of what we are is we can see these as opportunities for regeneration and growth as we look
yeah.
at the ways we haven't done it
As individuals and as a group.
and as a community. Yeah. Yeah. Amen. Well, awesome reflection and question. And I think this has been good. We've unearthed a lot of things, and but left some mystery. So hopefully, people will still buy your book. And will that be available to order? Will it be a ebook? How's
Well,
it
I
going?
will have to be an ebook
Okay.
and
Uh huh.
um, and they're babbling about making an audiobook, and I'm just like, well, that may be
That would be fun.
I'm like, like, I'm not sure we're gonna have this many readers. Well, we'll see.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of people like to listen to books while they're jogging or on the
And the
elliptical.
people doing the publishing are very
Yeah.
excited about it, and I'm like, "Okay," like, I always envisioned, like, maybe 300 books being sold, but apparently they feel it's more likely than not.
In our modern life, it's hard sometimes to find time to sit down and read a book. So yeah, a lot of people do like. Well, if you need some volunteers to read it, who knows? I imagine there's some Swedenborgian out there who's been wanting to be a audio book reader. So
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I have too many language problems to
okay,
think of doing
you
it
don't have to
myself.
be the reader. You could choose
I
the
don't have to
person.
be the reader. I was the writer, like
One last comment from one of our attendees. I've been pushing for a denominational position or statement on important issues so we can speak with one big voice. Very little support has been given. Most churches do this kind of thing. Yeah. We do have statements, and I know like the statement that went out about in support of LGBTQ marriage. I know Colin in his work with the Rainbow Church often will go to Pride events and have the statement out there on the table. We can put out statements. Again, it usually has a little space for people who
Not everybody.
disagree, but we're not always so good at making statements quickly, or
Right.
in response to direct actions. It's more these are on the books in
Right.
the journal, but it's possible there was one put out about racism. I'm sure there has been.
I don't
That would be a good thing for
think
me to
that.
dig into. I know
Yeah.
there have been statements about how we don't discriminate against and like the different areas of
Right.
discrimination have been
Right.
named. So maybe not a specific statement about
Right.
anti-racism, which maybe would be a project for SAR. Who knows? Not to give you more to do. Well, thank you so much, Sue, for all your time and your work and your commitment and your research. And thank you all for being here and listening to us tonight and supporting this Be Honest event. Our next one will be the last Tuesday in May. So it'll be the same time, 7 to 8:30, Tuesday, May 26th. And that will be on LGBTQ identity, marriage, gender, sexuality, and the church. Reverend Colin Amato of the Rainbow Church will be a part of that conversation. Tira Keel, who's in the process of planting Bloomhaven, a new spiritual community in Bernathen, specifically for LGBTQ community. And our very own Alex Gayhart of the Helen Keller Spiritual Life Collaborative will be a part of that conversation. So that'll be a little bigger group conversation in May. So come back for that.
Goodbye, everybody.
Thank you, Sue. Bye-bye, everyone. Have a great night.
To be intimate, to be on.